My guest today is Bart Hedges. Bart's an actuary and most recently the CEO of Greenlight Re, stepping down earlier this year. Reinsurance is a conservative business, and Bart, to me, always sat at a contrarian edge of the mainstream reinsurance market. I admire that quality, and I admire Bart Hedges. Bart, welcome to the show.
Good morning, David, and thanks very much for having me.
So you're originally from Baltimore and are an actuary now by training, but I learned recently that actually you're the son of a salesman, and I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what your father did and what sort of things you learned from that.
Good place to start. So my dad was a car salesman. He sold everything from Chevrolets to Mercedes, Porsche, and Audi, and he always got paid based on commission checks. So he was always working hard to provide. And I guess the apple didn't fall too far from the tree because his salesman abilities seemed to rub off on me from an early age, and I've always had the knack for trying to sell. Obviously, it's a little bit different selling a car versus selling a reinsurance deal, but even as an analytical actuarial type, I love to be involved in selling and gaining the trust of clients to try to get them to do business with the company.
And what would you say is your first sales experience in life?
Boy, I don't know if I could remember the first real sales experience, but I remember when I became an actuary and I was working in consulting, and it was the first time I was responsible for generating billable hours. I remember doing a lot of legwork and laying a lot of groundwork with a lot of people to get somewhat known, because in the business you got to be somewhat of a known commodity, I think, to start to sell. And I did a lot of presentations, a lot of things that didn't seem to pay off immediately. But they paid off in the long run because, you started to get a reputation and people started to understand that you had some knowledge. And then one of my early clients with Deloitte & Touche, I had sold a project to do reserving to them, but then followed it up and did pricing work for them as well, doing some state filings, which wasn't the most sexy work in the world, but it was bringing in some billable hours, and that was a good thing when you're a consultant.
And do you think that those are complicated products, right? As you pointed out, selling reinsurance or selling consulting work, very complex relationship, ongoing. It's not just a one and done kind of thing as selling a car would be. But do you think that there's any qualities of that sales process that your father would recognize and say, yeah, it's just sales? Any advice that he could have given you, I don't know if he did or not, but might have been able to give you that would have helped you in those experiences?
I think the commonality between any kind of selling, whether you're selling a one and done product or whether you're selling a long-term relationship, one piece of commonality is that you do have to develop a common level of trust, and the person purchasing from you does have to trust that you're giving them the straight poop about the deal, and if they don't trust, then they typically don't buy, and they certainly don't. If they don't trust, they certainly don't get into long-term relationships. So I think that's one very common thing across all kinds of sales, and in doing more complicated deals, a lot of times it takes a while to build up that trust. It may take many attempts with somebody to get them to trust you enough to actually pull the trigger and do a deal.
There's obviously a kind of, I don't know what you call it, stigma, I suppose, associated with car salesmen. It's just a used car salesman kind of thing where the one and done nature works against them, or at least reputationally, where they don't care about you as a person, they only care about securing the sale. I think that that's nuts myself. I imagine you would agree with that, but in what way do you build trust for such a short transaction? Is it valued differently, or is it actually just totally the same thing?
No, I think there's a bit of a difference in that when the person comes to buy a car, they come for a reason. They need a car. They want to buy a car. They're generally not just out shopping around looking to see if they happen to find a good deal. They're probably in the market to buy a car. So they want to get a transaction done. So I think they're more looking for expertise in the product. And if you have the expertise in the product, I think you can establish your level of knowledge, which then turns quickly into some level of trust. It's different for a long-term reinsurance deal. I think you have a situation where, you know, somebody probably is buying or is contemplating buying, but they probably have a lot of people that they've already worked with in the past. And when you're trying to do a new deal with somebody, getting in there to displace someone is difficult. And that's the part that I think can take a long time. And I think unless that person gets to experience you and what you're really about, they'll never develop enough level of trust to pull the trigger.
There's another story that I'd like you to tell, which is about you as I think maybe a teenager, where you worked in a grocery store and started your own business. Maybe you could tell that tale.
Yeah, it's a kind of a funny story in that when I was 16, 17 years old, and I was working for a grocery store, bagging groceries and mopping floors, and I decided I wanted to do a little bit more, but there weren't any more hours at the store. So I figured out that basically everybody that came to work, that the grocery store was literally like 200 yards from my house. Lots of those people are driving to work, and they all needed to get an oil change, and a lot of them would like to have their car look good. So I started my fellow employees at the giant grocery store and put a little flyer up and advertised. I don't remember how much it was. It was like $35 or $40 to have me take the keys to your car and drive your car up to my house and change the oil and grease all the grease fittings, and then clean it up, vacuum it out, and clean it up, and have it back by the time you were ready to leave. And it caught on. I ended up being very busy, and I could do as much of it sort of as I wanted to do. And very quickly, I had a bunch of regulars that would, you know, whether they were getting the oil changed or not, they would like to have the car cleaned. So, you know, every other week or every week or something, I would be cleaning somebody's car, and then once every couple of months, I'd be changing the oil. And it worked out really good. I learned an awful lot about small businesses and trying to deliver on product and service, and you know, it served me well later. And in fact, it probably helped get me my first job as an actuary, because I specifically remember when I had it on my resume and interviewed, people always wanted to talk about it. And then when I got my first job, I kind of asked the guy, I said, you know, I know there was a lot of people. And he said, well, one of the things that distinguished you was this little business that you started and your aptitude to running something. So it paid off in spades.
I'll bet. Do you remember your first customer there? What in the car washing business? Do you remember how it actually?
Yeah, it was the assistant manager, and boy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now. But he had this beautiful blue and white pickup truck that I always loved, and he was the first one to give me a chance to do it.
And how did you approach him, or did he say, "Hey, can you clean my car for me? I'll give you $20." How did that actually come about?
No, I had come up with the idea, and then I talked it up a little bit, and then I just made up a flyer, and I put it up by where all the time cards were, and people would come in and see what was posted there, and he was the first one to pull the trigger and say, let's do it.
And what did your dad think about that business?
Oh, I think he liked it a lot, because he saw me getting extra hours, so to speak, working and developing something, and of course he had taught me about changing oil and greasing and all that kind of stuff. So, I was a kind of a hands-on guy, and then I got away from being a hands-on guy, and now I'm back to being a hands-on guy. but yeah, it was a good little thing.
And yet you chose to go in a very different path when you went away to university, or went down the road to university, I suppose, in Baltimore. Why didn't that experience affect you even more? Because I would think, like, when I was in high school, a bit more of a directionless lad than you, it seems. But if I kind of cottoned on to some business idea that was making me real money, I'd think maybe this is what I should do, or some version of this. But instead, you kind of left it behind, I suppose, and went and started studying something much more abstracted in mathematics, if I got that right.
Yeah, I followed what I was good at, and I was always good at math, and it was never difficult for me. And I figured long term, it was better for me to get into business, some sort of business, than to I had progressed a lot in the grocery store. I could have gone into a training program, become a manager in a grocery store, and I'm sure I would have enjoyed that, but it probably wouldn't have led me to do the things that I've gotten to do as an actuary and running a public company. But I just followed what I was good at, and the math was what I was good at, and then the math led me to actuarial science, and actuarial science turned out, for me, I always viewed the actuarial science part of insurance as being kind of the best training ground and the best overall training for being an insurance expert. And for me, the end wasn't to become an actuary. I was more of a reluctant actuary.
Reluctuary.
Even my path through the exams wasn't the best. I got through. It took me a while, but even when I started, one of my friends talked me into taking part 1 and part 2 together, and because he had passed part 1 and part 2. And I thought, if he can do it, I can do it. So I took part 1 and part 2, and I got 2 5s and failed both tests. But that was the dumbest thing I ever did. And, I had to slow down and take them one at a time. And I plugged through and eventually got there, even though I quit one time and then came back to it.
I wonder a little bit about the alternative universe, Bart Hedges. I wonder if you actually would have been just fine. Maybe you would have run the grocery store chain or something like that. Because I have a good friend of mine who went to university for chemistry, got a master's in biochemistry, but all throughout that he was a lifeguard in high school and kept on with the lifeguarding world while he was in university as a part-time job. I don't know if you ever were a lifeguard, but man, is that an awesome job for a high school kid to have you sit around all day and get paid very well. Hopefully you don't ever have to use the skills. He never did, to my knowledge. But anyway, he kept at it and eventually went into administration in his town and is now rising through the ranks of the city and decided to do that full time. And he's kind of on the board of the Lifeguarding Association of Canada or something. And that wound up taking the other path, right? And I think about your boss at F&G who hired you for that entrepreneurial spark that you had there, and maybe that's actually the quality that matters, and not necessarily the ability to do the math. Is that when you came to run Greenlight, obviously you needed to understand the insurance business, but I wonder, or maybe you can tell me since I have you on the line here, whether you think the actuarial skills or the entrepreneurial skills were more important.
Well, I think it's definitely a combination of the two, but of the two, I think the entrepreneurial skills are they're a little bit more difficult to find in people. And I know that because I'm not speaking about myself per se, but I know that because as an employer, as a person trying to hire people and surround yourself with people who you want to help you run the business, you're looking for those qualities all the time. And I've had a lot of people work with me and a lot of people work for me, and it's very difficult to find those entrepreneurial skills in people so that they will step up, take responsibility for something, and try to develop a direction for the business that may or may not be the same as the direction that I had thought about. And just because I thought about it one way doesn't mean that that's the right way. It's easy to find people that you can give direction to that can execute. It's difficult to find people that can come up with an idea and then develop it and then execute it as well. So I think being an actuary in the insurance business, as I said, gives you the training and the expertise, and it gives you a level of accepted knowledge, right from the time you introduce yourself. But the entrepreneurial skills, I think, probably led me to become a manager and eventually a CEO of a company.
The downside of having entrepreneurial people, of course, is that they're going to, like you mentioned or alluded to there, are going to go and be entrepreneurial whether you agree with them or not. And that quality is great when they succeed, but not so great when they disagree with you and fail. I'm wondering if you could recall a situation where you had somebody who had that kind of spark as well and did something you disagreed with. You found it very difficult to navigate through that in the relationship and maybe in the business when they made a decision you genuinely thought was a bad one. Has that ever happened?
It has happened, and and you think about it a lot as a manager, as a CEO, because you're constantly trying to develop people as well as develop the business. And I've always thought about the developing people part. You have to create an environment for people to step up and take responsibility and have ideas, but you also have to be willing to let them fail from time to time. And the key is to be able to have enough control over a situation that a failure doesn't cost you more than what the learning experience should be worth. And there certainly have been times when, especially young people that are that have the entrepreneurial qualities, the last thing you want to do is squash it by telling them, I know this isn't going to work out well, so you can't do it. So in some instances, you kind of have to let them work their way through it, and then they figure out that, geez, this didn't work very well, and here's what I learned from it. But as I said, the key is to figure out what's that learning experience worth, and can you control the situation enough so that it doesn't get away from you. And if it's an underwriter who wants to go write a deal, it's a very different thing than an underwriter, an actuary, or anybody else in the business who has an idea to execute something, but you don't necessarily think it's going to work, but it's not going to cost you a lot. And, there's a big difference between writing a bad deal and setting up a bad project.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the most successful reinsurance companies that I work with tend to have a pretty similar process, certainly in the casualty lines of business, where you bring in a deal and there's not a lot of concrete, I suppose, underlying first, sort of micro foundations, if you use an economic term, to the exposure. Whereas for something like catastrophe business, hurricane's going to roll over Florida, you can at least count the buildings and add up something like what they're going to cost if they all get knocked over and have an idea for what's going to happen. And maybe you don't know what the probability of a hurricane is, but you can make that up a little bit and probably not be too far off and have an idea for what's going on. In casualty, where it's premises liability or auto liability, it's much harder to know what really is happening. And so I think that it's a harder decision to make and requires a lot more judgment and expertise. And so back to my observation on reinsurance companies, they tend to have this collective decision-making process where they roundtable an idea and they kind of knock it around internally with very highly skilled experts, being the underwriting team and the CEO and maybe even higher, and come up with a collective decision on it. That is not entrepreneurial decision-making at all. So how do you reconcile that? The desire for people to take a, I don't know if take a risk is the right way of thinking about it, but at least push hard on an idea that they think is right. And yet, as you pointed out, the downside risk of getting something wrong is huge. And so, if anything, you want a bureaucracy to, and I mean bureaucracy in kind of a value-neutral way there, to make sure we quash all the good ideas, all the bad ideas, right? No false positives.
Yeah, the environment that I tried to develop was it's been the same since really for quite a long time, whether it was at Scandinavian Re, whether it was at Platinum, or whether it was at Greenlight. It was really all kind of the same environment that I was trying to develop, and I think it worked pretty well, which was I always looked for underwriters and actuaries who could work together, because you need both sides of the equation. You need the what I would think of as more people-oriented skills of the underwriter with the quantitative skills of the actuary. And sometimes you found both in a single person, which is fine. But you needed both. And then what we tried to do was to, empower the teams through the collective knowledge of the group. And there's a difference between telling an underwriter, what to do versus trying to impart your wisdom on them and letting them come to the conclusion that it's good or bad. And at the end of the day, if you're really sure that a deal is going to be a bad deal, or if you're pretty sure it's going to be a bad deal, because you never can be 100% sure. At some point you probably have to exercise authority, but the idea was to allow the teams to come up with a product, sell to somebody, decide what they thought the right deal is, and then present it. And the idea in presenting it was to get feedback from the rest of the team, knowing that there's probably questions they didn't ask. There's probably critical information that they either received and didn't look at, or didn't receive, or didn't ask for. And rarely would somebody bring a deal to our deal team and walk away with just a quick yes, because there was always something that somebody had learned somewhere else, whether it was me or one of the other people involved. And the idea was to get them to embrace that as a learning experience and not feel like it was a bureaucratic, kind of thing where they were being told what to do. And and honestly, it didn't always work. There were people who couldn't, embraced that kind of culture and wanted to go off and have their own authority to write deals, and those people just didn't work out in that kind of environment. But most of the time it worked, and over my career, I always think about deals in two ways. I guess it's the actuary in me. I think about it as the batting average. How many did you write? How many went well? And then you think about, of the ones that didn't go well, how bad did they go? How bad off were they? Because a good deal is good, but you usually have a limited upside. So you never worry about, I made way more money on this deal than I thought we were going to make. And if you make it, you make it, but you don't worry about it at all. But when you lose money on a deal, the downsides can be abnormally large relative to upsides. And we had a fantastic batting average, across multiple companies and multiple throughout the cycle. And on the downside, from time to time, you write a deal that goes bad. And I certainly was in agreement with deals that went bad. And you tend to learn a lot from those situations. They also tend to suck up a lot of your time. And so, once you learn that, you try to avoid that at all costs, pretty much.
Yeah, I have the way I like to think about it sometimes is the difference between a broking company and an underwriting company is broking companies are trying to avoid false negatives and underwriting companies are trying to avoid false positives. There's not really, I think a lot of the cultural differences do boil down to that. Sometimes people will make points about, the brokers are always trying to pull one over on other people and the underwriters are just conservative for no good reason and just saying no. And I think that those are both unfair caricatures of what good people do in both those kinds of organizations. But ultimately, brokers don't want good deals to go undone for them because that's revenue they lost that should have been had. And underwriting companies can get blown up by a bad deal that they mischaracterize as a good deal.
Yeah, but I think you make a good point, and it's one that I try to make to people all the time. You can have an underwriter that says no to every deal and they never lose money, but they also never write a deal. And the two mistakes are writing a bad deal and not writing a good deal. And I've seen and suffered through times when we couldn't get underwriters to write the good deal because of something that happened in the past, and they become gun shy. And you have to be, when you make a mistake, you have to take it for what it's worth, and then you got to move on. But you can't create an environment where people are so afraid to make a mistake that they won't write a deal, because then you failed.
You made a baseball analogy a minute ago, and I think you're a baseball fan, and I wonder if you've ever read the book or heard of the book, The Mental ABCs of Pitching. Heard of that?
No, I haven't, but maybe I should look it up.
It's a phenomenal book, and it's not even really, it's about pitching, of course, but it's not actually, with the lessons you get inside there aren't about pitching. I don't know where I came across it. It was years ago, but it's literally organized alphabetically, and there's just these little anecdotes or insights about pitching throughout the book. But one of the key ideas in that book, and it's kind of a I don't know what you call it, sort of a self-actualization kind of book. How to be great is really what this is about. And this is fast. And so the author is a big fan of, I think it's John Smoltz, who was a pitcher for the Braves in the 90s. I think it's him.
Yeah.
And he said the amazing. So he'll come off the mound at the end of a game, and in a game will have, who knows, won or lost. But the point is, he doesn't focus on the score. Somebody will ask him, how'd the game go? And he'll say, 62 out of 86. And what was that? He said, I pitched 86 pitches, and 62 of them went the way I thought they were going to go. And that was how he evaluated himself on whether he was able to execute the pitch that was called for, and maybe he's involved in the pitch selection as well, but it was actually whether he did his job was whether he got the pitch. And whether the batter hits the ball or not is up to the batter at that point, as long as he executes the pitch to the best of his ability. And so there's this cool kind of like sub-metric, right? Because when we evaluate pitchers, we evaluate on all sorts of things, usually runs scored, which is, that's a pretty good valuation metric as well, but ultimately that includes things which aren't under the pitcher's control. And the brilliance of the book is that it emphasizes that you should only measure yourself by things which are under your control. And you mentioned earlier about a batting average for companies, and I don't actually remember quite what the numerator was on that, but how do you evaluate success on a deal-by-deal basis at a reinsurance company?
Well, in the types of business that Greenlight and Platinum were involved in, it was a lot of big deals. we didn't write many small deals, so the portfolio was fairly easy to track. And I had a very good handle on every single deal and knew, all the metrics about all the deals. And we always had a pricing model that, we on pretty much every deal, we had a stochastic type of pricing model that would give us the expected upside of a deal, and we could track what we actually made on the deal versus what the model results were. And I kept statistics across the many years. I don't have them at my fingertips, but I always was looking at the two metrics that I said, which are, the batting average, i.e., of the deals that we wrote, how many of them made the money that we were supposed to make or better, and then I would look at how many of them would break even or better, because that was an important metric as well. Did we not lose money on? Last one was, of the deals that lost money, how bad were the losses, and were they within the realm of what you expected? Because it's one thing to write a deal that loses money. It's another thing to write a deal that loses a lot more money than you ever expected, because it was probably at risk to begin with.
And could you maybe tell a story about maybe a significant failure that might help the rest of the world? Something you learned from, and a bad deal you thought was good, a false positive?
Well, I think, the ones that got away from us that we lost a lot of money on, really, there weren't that many of them that got away from us over the years, but the ones that got away from us and we lost quite a bit more than we ever thought we would lose on, it always came down to something that was not captured in a pricing model. And I think the lesson to be learned is that no matter how good you are with the stochastic modeling and fitting the distribution and parameterizing everything, every part of the model and tracking it, there are exogenous factors. And that's where I think, a lot of companies can get off the track, especially with young underwriters, because you believe that you've got everything, and then something comes from the outside, and it could be something like a process changing that you didn't understand, or it could be something where the data that you got just wasn't right data, or didn't represent the kind of risk that you were taking, or it could be something as bad as there was fraud. And unfortunately, I've seen all of that, from the checks being written and stolen to claims being put out there that weren't part of our deals, or finding out after you wrote a deal that the data that you got wasn't all the data and was knowingly given to you as erroneous data. And those things happen, but you have to watch out for them. You have to trust the people you're doing business with, and when you do lose, you've got to find a way to mitigate the loss as much as you possibly can, as quickly as possible. And you have to remember all that when you're pricing the deals. Back to the whole environment of trying to create this environment where the people working on the deal understand and believe and want to present the deal to the team, because they figure that collective wisdom is better than an individual. Because a young person who's done a lot of work and comes up with a fancy spreadsheet and thinks they've got everything, you may miss a lot. And it might be as simple as, I know that guy and you can't trust him.
One of the puzzles, I guess, is how you incorporate such non-information, right? The unknown unknowns, as Don Rumsfeld once said, into your pricing process. I mean, any guidance on how somebody might do that? I mean, how do you figure that out, or even smell it or something? I mean, what do you do?
Well, I think smelling it is a great it's a great phrase, because I would say you do have to have a gut feel. And when you're working with people, I said I spent a lot of time to try to develop trust with people that I worked with. But over time, you develop trust with certain brokers, you develop trust with certain buyers, you develop trust with certain underwriters, and if there's a new person in the chain that you don't know, you have to be cautious. And you got to get to know people, because our business, the reinsurance business, is still a very people-oriented business. I mean, there's commodity parts of it that I think probably, don't fit the description that I'm talking about. But a lot of the business, especially in reinsurance, where deals are fairly unique, outside of property cat and some of the more commodity-driven types of deals, but the deals that you and I typically work on or would work on, liability-related deals, big deals, you've got to trust the people, and you've got to have a knack for smelling something that's wrong. And when it's wrong, you've got to call it into question. If you can't figure it out and explain it, then you got to walk away from it.
In that vein, some of the best underwriters that I've worked with spend a lot of time, way more time than you kind of expect as a broker, talking about why, right? Why this deal? Why now? What does the customer want? What's going on here? What's the underlying motivation? And I think that digging into that can really help uncover all sorts of things which would be very helpful for an underwriter to know, and maybe even the broker can learn sometimes about things, because it's not something that, you know, we would ask such questions as well, of course, and we kind of are poor man underwriting deals at our front gates too, to try and make sure we're not bringing bad business to the marketplace, but we're not as good as the underwriters are. And so it's always interesting whenever you wind up in a deep conversation about that. Now that is, you have an interesting story about, I think, maybe the first time where you started learning about what insurance customers actually want back at F&G. I'm wondering if you could relate that story when you went out into the field as an actuary and started talking to customers.
Yeah, I think it's a good point you're bringing up, because we spend a lot of time trying to understand the hows and the whys of what people are trying to purchase. But I think the story that you're referring to was one where I was pretty young actuary. I mean, working in a commercial pricing group that with USF&G. So this would have been in the late 80s. USF&G was falling on hard times at the time, and it was probably in the turnaround phase at that point. It was a kinder time when the regulators would let you work through problems, probably, and the rating agencies would let you work through problems, probably more so then than they would today. And I was part of a small group that would go out into the field and go to the branch offices. USF&G had 35 or 40 branch offices, and they were the distribution sources, and they had all the real relationships. And my job was to get out there and explain to them the wisdom of raising rates and why raising rates across a wide variety of lines of business made sense. And the part that I didn't get was that they were under a lot of pressure to be able to sell, and they needed a commercially reasonable price to be able to put into the marketplace, but they didn't understand the idea of the additional revenue and higher profitability or less losses at the company to build the surplus was critical. And I learned a lot in that experience, and I got exposed to the very senior people that were at the front edge of the business, and it was one that probably shaped a lot of behavior for me over time.
I like to think of rate improvement as actuarial crack, because it sort of magically makes everything feel better or look better when there can be unobserved costs to it, and unobserved benefits as well. I mean, one of the unobserved benefits you get is you sort of get this interesting client own loss mitigation at the beginning, because they don't want the rates to go up even higher, and so they're much more careful about things, one would think. But maybe I don't know if you have any thoughts on what the unobserved costs might be. You just get a change in portfolio mix. You're implicitly selecting a different customer when you're raising your rates a lot. You're changing any kind of large portfolio change, sort of flings you out into the unknown again. And what is the marketplace going to give you for this new rate? Any thoughts on that?
Well, we always view rate changes as a necessary evil, because if you had a stable marketplace and your rates could stay relatively stable over time and just reflect cost differences, then you'd be in step with the market and you wouldn't be susceptible to some of the things that you described. But inevitably, a company will fall out of step with the market, or a market will have an exogenous force that changes things, and then it's unknown. So we would run into things like a state would introduce personal injury protection, or they would get rid of personal injury protection, or they would change the limits that were necessary for a private passenger automobile state, or change the way claims for, say, sinkholes were going to be handled for homeowners in Florida. And when those things happen, and you have to come up with a rate, or you're changing an existing rate to take into account something that it didn't take into account, it's very scary because your mix of business can change drastically, and you can have a lot of unintended consequences. And if you're selling one-year underlying products and you're a reinsurance company reinsuring a quota share on that portfolio, and a rate change is taking place on one-year products, it takes a while for it to get into the system. And if you get it wrong, it takes a lot longer to correct it. So the consequences of making the changes are big. And we started to tend towards products like non-standard automobile that had 3 and 6 month underlying policies, and you could make rate changes twice a year, and they would hit the system much quicker. So if you overpriced and were losing business, you could change it. If you were underpriced and accumulating too much business, you could change that too. But certainly, I think there are unintended consequences, and they can have real impacts on the book of business.
I think one way you can think about the non-standard auto example there is it shortens the feedback loop of action and reaction, and that's some of the challenges with longer tail lines of business. And I often wonder yet at the same time, non-standard auto can have a kind of a tricky reputation, and it's sort of in this group of lines of business in insurance, and as seen from the reinsurance world, where you got to watch it, right? And non-standard auto is one. You call it trucking business is another one. Workers' comp is another one, which is interesting to me. And what's common about those things is that they're all compulsory coverages, which is interesting. And what's uncommon in the sense of what's different among them is the different line, the tail of the line's business, where workers' comp was very long. And my always thought on workers' comp, the reason why people were wary of it was that the feedback loops are so long. It takes you such a long time to know whether what you've done was a good idea or not. Years, literally, before you can see the response in the business. Any reaction to that? I mean, do you agree with my characterization of those businesses? Any other you put in there? Why do you think that they are so challenging?
I guess broadly, I'd say I agree. When we thought about those kinds of lines of business, that we were always looking for characteristics of the business that fit best on the balance sheet that we were writing on. And at Greenlight, the balance sheet and what you were after was different than at Platinum, which was different than at Scandinavian Re. So you had to find the risk that fit the balance sheet. And at Greenlight, the things that we liked and the things that worked well in our pricing framework and the things that would be most valued in terms of the overall goals of the organization were lines of business that had a quick feedback loop in terms of the claims presenting themselves and would give you the knowledge of understanding whether the deal was going to work or not work quickly, but they would pay out over a long period of time. So, for instance, medical malpractice is a line of business that worked pretty well for Greenlight. We never wrote a ton of it, but the characteristics of it would work pretty well because, for the most part, it was claims-made business. The claims would be known within the 12 months or so of the period that you were presenting the risk. And usually there was some sort of a tail, 3 months or 6 months or whatever tail. But you would know whether the deal worked well or not. And then the claims would be adjudicated over a long period of time. And yes, there was uncertainty as to what the final payout was going to be. But you'd have a pretty good idea of whether or not you were going to make money on a deal or not. And that was important because we wanted to know, and we could correct. If we could renew the deal with somebody at different terms that would work, we would always try to renew the deal with somebody at different terms that did work. But the idea of getting into a line of business where it takes you a long time to get the claims, it takes you a long time to adjudicate the claims, it takes a long time to know whether or not you wrote a good deal. By the time you figured it out, you wrote 3 or 4 or 5, you probably renewed the deal 3 or 4 or 5 times, and then you figure out that you have 5 years worth of bad business. That's really difficult to manage. So we stayed away from those things. And then we thought about duration, I think, differently than most companies. And we value the ability to renew a deal highly. And so having a deal that had a short duration of payout but had a high probability of renewing was fine for us, because if I looked at 5 years of private passenger automobile across the block of business, the duration was whatever it was for a 1-year deal plus the fact that you renewed it 4 times. So we would look at duration of a short tail line of business that was renewed frequently, differently in terms of our wanting to acquire and hold on to the business than a lot of people did. So, like non-standard automobile was a big part of the Greenlight portfolio, and we liked it because those deals would renew and they would present the results pretty quickly, and we could help change the underlying rates pretty quickly. And, so it had a lot of good characteristics for Greenlight, whereas we didn't write a lot of long tail liability, even though the duration of the liabilities probably lent themselves to the investing side of the business.
It might be worth talking a little bit about the underlying business thesis of Greenlight, because it was a bit unique. It was certainly more unique at the time than it is now. Although I think that business model might be kind of fallen out of fashion much more recently. And I remember just a quick story. I remember when Greenlight first incepted, and it was kind of an off-cycle startup, because typically we were used to, at the time, after a large event, when you kind of have the turn of the market in the early 2000s, and then again after Katrina, after KRW in 2004, and then 2005, all the storms, then you had all these startups, and then Greenlight kind of came in on its own into the marketplace. It was a very different strategy from everybody else, and it was notable. And maybe you could talk a bit about how Greenlight came about, what sort of business models you guys had. I don't know if you were involved in the original founding of it, but what was the inspiration for it, and what was the point?
Yeah, I think I wasn't there at the very, very beginning. The hedge fund manager, David Einhorn, had been approached probably around the time that Max Re had gotten started, which was the late 90s. And he was presented the idea by someone who had been involved with Max Re, but the spin on it was, instead of the assets being invested into hedge funds where the assets were then locked up, the hedge fund manager would manage the funds of the reinsurance company in a segregated account, and then the insurance company or reinsurance company would have liquidity. So you weren't locked up in a hedge fund investment in the same way that say a Max Re model was developed. So anyway, he was presented with the plan. He liked the plan. He didn't have an opportunity to execute on it for several years, and then he finally, I think he got around to deciding, hey, this has been on the potential list of projects for a long time, and a new fellow had joined the group, and he asked him to either make this idea something worth doing, or let's get rid of it. And I guess fortunately for me, the fella Dan Reutman, who was the chief operating officer, I don't know what his title was at the time, but probably not chief operating officer at Greenlight Capital, but it was something like that. He liked the idea, and he started to develop it, and he liked it from a business perspective because it was very different than anything that was in the market. He liked it from the hedge fund perspective because if you think about it from the hedge fund's perspective, they ended up with essentially permanent capital to manage, where all the rest of the capital, aside from whatever was being managed of the employees and the owners of the hedge fund, was very temporary capital. It could leave probably in 1 year, in some cases 2 or 3 years. So having permanency, especially for a long-term value investor, permanency of capital was a big attraction. So it made sense from their perspective. They thought it made sense in the reinsurance world, and they said, hey, let's try to do something here that's going to be very different. And they actually launched it. The capital raise was in 2004, but they didn't get any part of the management team until 2005, and we didn't actually start writing business until 2006. So in 2004, when you had Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and Gene, Greenlight wasn't writing, they were investing, and they made money. And then in 2005, when you had KRW, Greenlight wasn't writing, and they were investing, and they were the most profitable reinsurance company in either of those years without underwriting anything. Of course, they were PFIC, and the investors were paying taxes on all their earnings and everything. But we entered the market in 2006, and we started underwriting when I joined and started to recruit underwriters and actuaries. And by the time I left, we had written, I don't know, $4 billion or so of business over the 10, 11 years.
Any observations about your brush with the hedge fund world? I mean, certainly at the time that was absolutely the apex of hedge fund investing in 2000, call it 5, 6, 7, uh, and then definitely had some humbling moments in 2008, 9, 10, and since really. I mean, the hedge fund world has never really recovered. The returns of the industry have never outperformed like they did. Any observations about the culture of that? I mean, David Einhorn's a famous guy, obviously turned in amazing results for a long time, and what do you think about that world?
Well, for me, the experience was a terrific one because I've always embraced change. I've always embraced learning. And not everybody likes change, and not everybody wants to be challenged to learn all the time. But working for a hedge fund reinsurance company when there was no accepted way that a hedge fund reinsurance company would work, because there really weren't any. I mean, Berkshire, you wouldn't call it a hedge fund reinsurance company. Their model was similar, but they were so established, so big, and their goal, i.e., total return, was the same, but it just wasn't the same as working with the hedge fund guys per se. But for me, sitting down with hedge fund guys who would challenge you to think about the reinsurance or insurance business differently, that was a real, cultural shift for me. And I can remember the first time after I was hired and I went up to New York to sit down with David and Dan Reutemann, the two people who were my main contacts with the hedge fund, and present this business plan that Len Goldberg, who was the CEO at the time, and myself had put together. They asked questions that reinsurance people don't ask, and they thought about the math of it very differently than reinsurance people thought about it. They asked questions that I didn't necessarily have answers to because nobody had really thought about the business that way. And I left there and I had a roaring headache, but I was also really enthusiastic about the business because I knew it was going to be fun and challenging. And the challenge over time, was to try to mesh the culture of a hedge fund with the culture of a reinsurance company, because they can't necessarily be the same. And some of the things that we ran into that were the most challenging were around, hey, the hedge fund does it this way, why can't the reinsurance company do it that way? And
Give me an example of that. Is there an example of a real clash, cultural clash? Because you'd think that they're both risk-taking institutions. You'd think that they would have a lot of similarities. I would have thought.
Well, I think the biggest one simply was the way the remuneration system would work at a hedge fund versus the remuneration system works at a reinsurance company. And you think, hey, they can be pretty similar. And Greenlight had a pretty unique way of paying our employees, where we would hold back on paying underwriting bonuses for quite a while, but you were vested in it, and it was going to be paid, but it would be paid over time, and it would accrue the investment returns on the hedge fund while that money was sitting aside. But in the hedge fund world, they pay for actual results. And in the reinsurance world, even though we make these long-term decisions, a lot of times people are paid based on calendar year results, which, is a very different way of paying people from the hedge fund. So a lot of the differences came about because of that. And there were simple things like that the hedge fund world deals in, they have a huge spectrum of risks that are highly liquid that you can either go long or short on. And in the reinsurance world, you have a very defined set of risks that you can be involved in, and you really can only go long. And once you're long, you have to keep the risk. And that's not an absolute, because you can buy out things, and you could do an LPT and other kinds of things. But by and large, the reinsurance business is a long only hold strategy for a small number of opportunities relative to. That was a huge cultural difference, and I'm not sure that it was ever bridged at Greenlight, and I don't know how it works in other hedge fund reinsurers, but I think that was probably the biggest challenge for me over 11 years.
We're running low on time, actually, but there's one other I guess, part of your career that I'd like to touch on. And so you're the CEO. You've been a couple of CEOs, CEOships under your belt there, and obviously that's a goal for many people in the world is to become a CEO potentially, and CEO of a public company is an interesting kind of role. I'm wondering if you could tell the story of your rise to CEOship at Scandinavian Re, how that came about, and then what happened.
That was a little different in that. The first time I was CEO was at Scandinavian Re, and I joined there as an actuary. I quickly transitioned into a role as an underwriting actuary. I was still probably called actuary, but I was an underwriting actuary. The company, Scandinavian Re, was part of a financial group that was owned by ABB. We had a sister company, which was Sirius, a Swedish company. And the board was all Swedish board because the Scandinavian Re wasn't publicly traded, but ABB was publicly traded, so this was a subsidiary company. And ABB was falling on some hard times, and they started to want to, make some changes. One of the things they were looking at was reinsurance, and as I was progressing through my career there, and I had gone from underwriting to managing part of the portfolio, and then as the then CEO was transitioning out, ABB had made a decision to sell the company. So there was a need for, regulatory need for the company to have a CEO. So I was Don CEO, even though it wasn't CEO in a traditional role of, hey, let's plan the strategy and let's run the company for a long term and see how much value you could create. The role for me there was, we need you to be the CEO long enough to try to help us sell the company. But I still learned a lot about leadership in that role, and I learned a lot about managing the expectations of a board versus, actual outcomes that you can achieve. And they paid off because at Platinum, I was CEO of a subsidiary company again, and was active with the board of directors, the public company board of directors. And then at Greenlight, when I joined, I was happy enough to be the number 2 person and had a very good arrangement with the CEO. And Len liked to do the things that I didn't necessarily want to do. He was happy to be involved with the rating agencies and the board and investors, and I was very comfortable being the operational guy, hiring people and doing deals and selling and managing all the aspects of actually, running the company. And that was a very good marriage until Lenny decided to retire. And then the idea was, hey, am I going to be CEO or am I going to work for another CEO? And when they offered me the job, I decided I would take it and run with it. And I'm glad that I did. But it's very different and very challenging in different ways being CEO of a public company. The public company expectations are high. The board expectations are high, and trying to create an environment with the board to work together and be collaborative is difficult. But it was a fun job, and you get recognized for it, and you learn a lot of things that I think you can keep for the rest of your life, no matter what you do.
Any other detail on kind of the things that surprised you about how hard it was? I mean, it's kind of one of those things where, almost like actuarial exams, I think of that before I started taking them, where everybody says, oh, that's so hard, and, it's a bit intimidating, and once you get into them, you kind of realize, yeah, these are pretty hard, but in ways that maybe surprise you in their details, if not in kind of the overall evaluation. What are some stuff about the CEOship that surprised you and how difficult it was? Would you recommend to people to become a public company CEO?
Oh, I don't think it's for everybody, for sure. I think there's probably people that would be more, that would be better than I was at doing it because they probably had a different skill set than I did. But the things for me, I'm an analytical guy who happened to come from a sales background. So as I said, I always liked all the operational parts of the business. I always like to be involved in the deals. I always like to go visit brokers and talk about the business. Managing the external constituencies was more difficult than I thought. Took way more time than I thought. That was ratings, that was investors, and that was the board. Probably in the reverse order. The board took the most time. The rating agencies took the second most time. The investors, for me, took the third most time. And the challenges of the hitting the expectations of the board and managing the expectations of everybody within the company and trying to do things in something that everybody agreed on. That was difficult, and I think that was probably the biggest challenge. Delivering the results of what they were to do, that was sometimes within your role, sometimes not. But generally speaking, we did the right plan, we'd execute a plan, and that was pretty good. But it was where there's fundamental things about the business that board members think differently about employees, and you have to say, why can't we do this? And you never say because the board doesn't want you. Bad answer. That's a very bad answer. So you have to find ways of explaining things to people that that they're difficult to explain, and then you'd have to try to find ways to explain to the board, hey, the things that we need to do that you may not be 100% comfortable with, but for the good of the overall organization, we need to try to do some of these things, and that was difficult. So that was my kind of perspective on it, what I learned from it.
And what do you think about governance at public companies? Sometimes, some public companies will have a chairman, CEOship embodied in one person. Others have, as you say, as your experience, I think, was as a pretty independent-minded board that challenges the CEO. What do you think? What do you think is the right way of organizing that? Do you think it was a healthy dynamic? Were you jealous of these guys who seem to, stack the board with their own people and can run whatever they want? What's your reaction to that?
I would say I probably was a little jealous of people that they were the chairman, they would stack the board, and it was truly their organization. But from a governance perspective, I would say that probably is not the best way to do it. I think, we always had a separate chairman and CEO. I don't think that probably would ever change at Greenlight as long as David is involved. I think there were a lot of benefits to having David being chairman of the company. One, it showed that the person who was running the asset portfolio was highly, highly vested in the organization, and it showed that he cared about it. And I remember, one time he was on a panel, and there were guys that were chairmen of companies, and they would talk about, I spend 20% of my time on this company, and they asked David about his role, and he said, I'm chairman of Greenlight Re every day. And, that was the way he thought about it. I wouldn't say he was overly active. He was active in the business, and he was there for me when I needed him to be. But the board was an independent-minded board, and they challenged me. The only thing the thing that was most challenging for me was to try to either live up to that or to make it into more of a collaborative thing than simply a challenge. And that was what I worked on a lot, was to try to make the decisions with the board become collaborative so that we could agree on the strategy and not have it be, either their strategy or my strategy. It needed to be our strategy. And that was difficult. And when you're the chairman of that board and you're the execution guy, that's a simple task. But when you have it split, that can be a very difficult task, depending on who you're working with.
Back to the selling, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Right back to selling, which is kind of where we started all this.
It was, and I think we'll have to leave it there, Bart. I really appreciate your time. My guest today was Bart Hedges. Bart, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, David, and good luck with everything.
Thanks for listening to today's conversation. If you enjoyed it, please leave a rating and comment in iTunes or your podcast app of choice, as it helps others discover the show. Feedback to notunreasonablepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.